She looked up to see her husband of 20 years standing in the doorway, his shoulders rigid, his face wearing that expression she'd come to recognize, the one he used during difficult board meetings. Richard Sullivan, chief executive officer of Sullivan Industries, had never been one for gentle conversations. "Richard," she said softly, setting the test on the mahogany desk beside her coffee cup, "I have something wonderful to tell you. Frankly, Margaret, this conversation is overdue." He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him with a soft click. "I've been thinking about our marriage, about where we're headed, and I believe it's time we face reality." The clock on the mantel ticked steadily, marking seconds that felt like hours. Outside, the storm intensified, rain lashing against the windows of their Westchester County home, the house they'd bought together when Richard's business began to flourish, when they dreamed of filling the empty bedrooms with children's laughter. "What reality?" Margaret asked, though something deep in her stomach already knew. Something beyond morning sickness. Richard smoothed his tie, a nervous habit she'd noticed more frequently lately. "We've grown apart, Margaret. We want different things. Frankly, I think we've both known this for some time." "I'm pregnant," she said quietly. The words hung in the air between them like a bridge neither seemed willing to cross. Richard's face went pale, then flushed red. That's unfortunate timing," he said finally. "Unfortunate?" Margaret stood slowly, her hand instinctively moving to her still flat stomach. "We've been trying for 3 years. Richard, 3 years of specialists and procedures, and hoping. I want a divorce." The words hit her like a physical blow. She gripped the edge of the desk, her knuckles white against the dark wood. "I don't understand," she whispered. "I found someone else, Margaret. Someone who understands my ambitions, who supports my goals, someone who makes me feel alive again." Richard's voice took on that clipped, business-like tone he used when discussing quarterly reports. "Moving forward, I think it's best for both of us if we end this marriage amicably." Through the rain-streaked window, Margaret could see headlights cutting through the darkness. A car sat in their circular driveway, engine running, windshield wipers moving rhythmically. Even through the storm, she could make out a silhouette in the passenger seat, long blonde hair, a young face lit by the glow of a cell phone screen. "She's here," Margaret said, the realization hitting her like another thunderclap. "She's waiting for you." Richard had the decency to look uncomfortable. "Stephanie didn't want to intrude on our conversation." "Stephanie?" Margaret tasted the name like something bitter. "Your secretary, my assistant, and frankly, she's become much more than that." Margaret sank back into her chair, the pregnancy test sliding across the desk's polished surface. 20 years of marriage, 20 years of supporting his dreams, hosting his business dinners, smiling graciously at charity events while he networked and climbed the corporate ladder. 20 years of putting her own ambitions on hold while she tried to become the perfect executive's wife. "How long?" she asked. "Does it matter? How long, Richard?" He sighed, checking his expensive watch. 8 months. 8 months. While she'd been injecting fertility hormones and tracking ovulation cycles, while she'd been decorating the nursery they'd never used, while she'd been believing in their future together. "I suppose you've already spoken to a lawyer," she said. "Patricia Wells. She's excellent, discreet. She'll make sure this is handled properly." "Your lawyer. She can recommend someone for you, of course, someone appropriate." The rain continued its assault on the windows, and Margaret found herself thinking about the metaphor, how fitting that her marriage was ending during a storm. She pressed her hand against her stomach again, thinking about the tiny life growing inside her, the child who would grow up knowing her father had abandoned them both before she was even born. "I need time to process this," she said finally. "Of course, I'll be staying at the club tonight. Tomorrow we can discuss the details, division of assets, custody arrangements for the child, that sort of thing." "Custody arrangements." Margaret's voice rose. "Richard, you just told me our baby was unfortunate timing. Be that as it may, I have responsibilities, financial obligations." He straightened his cufflinks, another nervous habit. "I'm not a monster, Margaret. I'll do what's right." Through the window, the car's headlights flashed twice. Stephanie was getting impatient. "You should go," Margaret said quietly. Your girlfriend is waiting. Richard paused at the door. For what it's worth, Margaret, I hope you'll find happiness. You deserve someone who can give you what you need. And what is it you think I need? Someone simpler. Someone who doesn't require as much. After he left, Margaret sat alone in the office, listening to the storm rage outside. She heard the front door close, heard car doors slam, heard the engine fade into the distance as Richard drove away with his new life. She picked up the pregnancy test again, studying those two pink lines. In the span of 10 minutes, she discovered she was finally going to be a mother and that her marriage was over. Life, it seemed, had a cruel sense of timing. The phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. The caller ID showed her sister's number. Claire, she answered, her voice barely above a whisper. Maggie, you sound terrible. What's wrong? Margaret looked around the home office at the family photos on the shelves, at the awards and commendations Richard had received over the years, at the life they'd built together that was apparently nothing more than a house of cards. Richard wants a divorce, she said simply. What? Why? What happened? He's been having an affair with his secretary, his 26-year-old secretary. Oh, Margaret's voice grew stronger with each word. And Claire, I'm pregnant. The line went quiet except for the sound of her sister's sharp intake of breath. Oh, honey. Oh, Maggie. Are you okay? Where is he now? Gone with her. They're probably at his hotel room right now, celebrating their freedom. That bastard, Claire said fiercely. That absolute bastard. Listen to me, Maggie. You're going to get through this. You're going to fight for what's yours, and you're going to win. Margaret touched her stomach again, thinking about the child who would depend on her, who would need her to be strong. I hope you're right, she said. I know I'm right. You're a Sullivan now, but you were born a Bennett, and Bennett women don't give up without a fight. The next morning brought gray skies and the sound of moving boxes scraping across hardwood floors. Margaret sat in her kitchen, still wearing yesterday's clothes, watching as Richard's assistant, not Stephanie, but a different one, an older woman with kind eyes, supervised the removal of his belongings. Mrs. Sullivan, the woman said gently. Mr. Sullivan asked me to give you this. She handed Margaret an envelope with her name written in Richard's precise handwriting. Inside was a business card for Patricia Wells, attorney at law, and a note that read, Patricia comes highly recommended. She'll treat you fairly. R. Even in divorce, Richard was managing her choices. Margaret's phone buzzed with an incoming call from Claire. How are you holding up? Honey, her sister asked. I'm watching strangers pack up 20 years of my life, Margaret replied, observing as the movers wrapped Richard's golf trophies in newspaper. He left me a lawyer's business card and a note. Very efficient. He gave you his lawyer's card, the same lawyer who's representing him. No, apparently she'll recommend someone appropriate for me. Margaret made air quotes even though Claire couldn't see them. Richard's already thought of everything. Maggie, you can't use a lawyer his lawyer recommends. That's like asking the fox to recommend a chicken coop designer. Margaret watched as the movers carried out the antique desk that had belonged to Richard's grandfather, the desk where she'd learned she was pregnant just 12 hours ago. I suppose you're right, she said. I feel so overwhelmed. Claire, he said frankly our marriage has been over for years, 20 years, and he gives me 20 minutes to process it. Listen to me carefully, Claire said, her voice taking on that protective older sister tone Margaret remembered from childhood. You're going to find your own lawyer, a good one, a shark, and you're going to make sure you get everything you deserve. I don't even know where to start. Start by calling Mom's old friend, Helen Morrison. Remember her? She's a family law attorney now. She'll know who to recommend. Margaret did remember Helen, a fierce woman who'd been one of her mother's bridge partners, known for her sharp wit and sharper tongue. Okay, Margaret said. I'll call her. Good. And Maggie, document everything. Every asset, every account, every piece of property. Take pictures, make copies. Don't trust Richard to be honest about what you're entitled to. After Claire hung up, Margaret walked through the house, really looking at it for the first time in years. The marble countertops in the kitchen, the crystal chandeliers in the dining room, the Persian rugs in the living room, All of it had been chosen together, purchased with money from Richard's business, money that had grown substantially during their marriage. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Hi, Margaret, it's Stephanie. Richard wanted me to reach out about picking up some things he forgot. Would tomorrow afternoon work? Thanks XOXO." Margaret stared at the message, at the casual tone, at the kisses and hugs from the woman who had destroyed her marriage. The audacity was breathtaking. She typed back, "Richard can make his own arrangements. Do not contact me again." The response came immediately. Like, "Okay, but there's no need to be mean about it. We're all adults here." Margaret deleted the message thread and blocked the number. By late afternoon, the house felt hollow and strange. Richard's presence had been removed so efficiently it was as if he'd never existed there at all. Margaret found herself standing in their bedroom, her bedroom now looking at the half-empty closet, the vacant space on the dresser where his cologne and cufflinks had been. On her nightstand sat a framed photo from their wedding day. She was 22, radiant in white silk, gazing up at Richard with absolute adoration. He was 28, handsome and confident, looking at the camera rather than at her. She turned the photo face down. Her phone rang again. "Helen Morrison." "Margaret Bennett," Helen said warmly. "I was so sorry to hear about your situation. Claire filled me in." "It's Margaret Sullivan now," Margaret corrected automatically. "Is it for how much longer?" The question hit her oddly. She'd been Margaret Sullivan for 20 years, had built her entire adult identity around being Richard's wife. Who was Margaret Bennett? "I suppose that's to be determined," she said. "Well, I have someone I want you to meet. Jane Crawford. She's the best divorce attorney in the state, and she specializes in cases involving narcissistic abuse and complex financial arrangements. I don't know if we have significant assets. Richard handles all the finances. Honey, your husband is the CEO of a multi-million-dollar company. You have significant assets. The question is whether he's been honest about them." That evening, Margaret sat in her empty house, eating takeout Chinese food and trying to wrap her mind around her new reality. She was 42 years old, pregnant, and about to become a single mother. She had a master's degree in art history that she hadn't used in 20 years, no recent work experience, and no idea how much money she actually had access to. But as she touched her stomach and felt the first flutter of movement, probably too early to be the baby, but she chose to believe it was she realized something important. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for her child. And Bennett women, as Claire had reminded her, didn't give up without a fight. Her phone buzzed with another text, this time from Richard. "I hope you're being reasonable about this. Margaret, there's no need to make things difficult for either of us." She stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, "You're right. Richard, there's no need to make things difficult, so why don't you start by being honest about our assets?" His response came quickly. "I've always been transparent about our finances." Margaret laughed out loud, the sound echoing in the empty house. If Richard thought she was going to roll over and accept whatever scraps he offered, he was about to learn that he'd underestimated his wife of 20 years, severely underestimated her. The law offices of Crawford and Associates occupied the top 3 floors of a gleaming downtown building. Margaret had never been in a space that felt so deliberately intimidating, all dark wood and leather furniture. With law books lining the walls like soldiers at attention, Jane Crawford was nothing like what Margaret had expected. Instead of the severe, gray-haired woman she'd imagined, Jane was probably 45, with auburn hair and laugh lines around intelligent green eyes. She wore a perfectly tailored navy suit and spoke with the kind of confident authority that made you believe she could argue her way out of anything. "Tell me about your marriage," Jane said without preamble, settling behind her massive desk with a legal pad and pen. Margaret found herself recounting the whole story, the 20 years of marriage, Richard's business success, the fertility struggles, the pregnancy test, the storm, the secretary waiting in the car. "And you say he's been having this affair for 8 months?" Jane asked. "That's what he told me, which means it probably started earlier. Cheating husbands aren't known for their honesty about timelines." Jane made a note. "What do you know about your financial situation?" "Richard handles all of that. I have credit cards and access to our checking account, but the investments, the business accounts, the properties, he manages everything." "Red flag number 1, Jane said. Financial control is often a precursor to narcissistic abuse. What about income? Do you work? I stopped working when Richard's business took off. He said it would be better if I focused on supporting his career, managing our social obligations. Red flag number 2, making a spouse financially dependent is a classic control tactic. Jane leaned forward. Margaret, I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Has Richard ever made you feel stupid about money? Has he ever suggested that you're not capable of understanding financial matters? Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. Yes. He always said I was too trusting with money, that I needed someone to protect me from making bad decisions. Red flag number 3. Margaret, I think your millionaire ex-husband has been financially abusing you for years, and now he's trying to leave you with as little as possible while he starts fresh with his secretary. The words hit Margaret like a slap. Narcissistic abuse. She'd never thought of it that way. But as Jane explained, the patterns: isolation from finances, control over access to money, using economic dependence to maintain power, she realized how completely Richard had managed every aspect of their financial life. What can we do? Margaret asked. First, we're going to get a forensic accountant to examine every financial record from the past 5 years. Second, we're going to make sure you have immediate access to funds for living expenses. Third, we're going to find out exactly what your husband is hiding. You think he's hiding something? Jane smiled grimly. Honey, and in my experience, when a wealthy man suddenly wants a quick divorce after 20 years of marriage, he's definitely hiding something. After leaving Jane's office, Margaret decided to stop for coffee at a cafe near the legal district. She needed time to process everything she'd learned, to absorb the reality that her marriage hadn't just ended, it had been built on a foundation of control and manipulation. She was waiting in line when she heard a familiar laugh. Turning slightly, she spotted Richard and Stephanie at a corner table, leaning close together over coffee and what looked like legal documents. Margaret's first instinct was to leave, but something made her stay. She ordered her coffee and found a seat at a nearby table, positioning herself so she could hear their conversation. Like, when the baby comes, we'll need the big house. Right, Stephanie was saying, her voice carrying that Valley Girl inflection that made everything sound like a question. The one with the pool. Frankly, Margaret will be fine in something smaller, Richard replied. Much smaller. The house is worth $3.2 million. She'll get her share, but she certainly doesn't need all that space for just herself and one child. What about the vacation house in the Hamptons? That stays with me. It's a business asset. I use it for client entertainment. Margaret nearly choked on her coffee. The Hampton house had been her retreat, the place where she'd spent weeks every summer, decorating and gardening and trying to build the perfect family life. Richard rarely spent more than weekends there. And the boat, Stephanie giggled. I've always wanted to learn to sail. The boat stays too. Again, business entertainment. Stephanie leaned across the table, placing her hand over Richard's. You're so smart about all this stuff. Like, I never would have thought about the business asset thing. It's all about positioning. Sweetheart, my attorney says as long as we can demonstrate business use, Margaret can't touch them. Margaret's hands began to shake. They were strategizing, planning how to keep her from getting what she was legally entitled to. And Stephanie, 26-year-old Stephanie, who said like every other word, was helping him do it. What about her family money? Stephanie asked suddenly. Like, didn't her parents leave her something? Richard's expression darkened slightly. Her parents left her some money. Yes, but it's been invested in the business for years. Part of our joint assets now. How much? $200,000 initially. With the business growth, it's probably worth close to $1 million now. Margaret nearly gasped out loud. She'd had no idea her parents' inheritance had grown so much, or that it was even still separately trackable. That's like a lot of money, Stephanie said. It is, but it's tied up in business assets now. Margaret agreed to the investment years ago. She signed papers. Margaret tried to remember signing any papers about her inheritance. She recalled a stack of documents Richard had presented to her shortly after her mother's death, explaining that they needed to organize their estate planning. She'd been grieving, overwhelmed, and had trusted Richard to handle the details. You're so smart, Stephanie said again. leaning closer. Like, Margaret probably has no idea about any of this stuff. Margaret has never understood business, Richard said dismissively. She's always been more focused on domestic concerns. The contempt in his voice was unmistakable. After 20 years of marriage, after supporting his career and sacrificing her own ambitions, this was how he saw her, as someone incapable of understanding the financial empire they'd built together. Margaret stood up carefully, trying not to make noise with her chair. She needed to leave before she said or did something she'd regret. But as she walked past their table, Stephanie looked up and their eyes met. "Oh," Stephanie said, loud enough for half the cafe to hear. "Margaret, hi." Richard turned, his face going pale when he saw her. "Margaret, this is unexpected." "Yes," Margaret said quietly. "I imagine it is." She walked out of the cafe with as much dignity as she could muster. But inside, her mind was racing. The conversation she'd overheard had given her crucial information about her own inheritance that she hadn't even known existed, and evidence that Richard was planning to hide assets that legally belonged to her. Jane Crawford had been right. Richard was definitely hiding something, and now Margaret knew exactly what she needed to find. That evening, Margaret sat in her kitchen reviewing the notes she'd made after her meeting with Jane Crawford. The house felt too quiet, too empty, and she found herself jumping at every small sound: the ice maker in the refrigerator, the grandfather clock in the hallway, the settling of the old wooden beams. She was considering calling Claire when her phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize. "Hello," she answered cautiously. "Margaret, this is Jake Morrison, Richard's business partner. I probably shouldn't be calling you." Margaret knew Jake, though they'd never been close. He was Richard's oldest friend, the two of them having started Sullivan Industries together 15 years ago. Jake was quieter than Richard, more thoughtful, and she'd always sensed he disapproved of Richard's more ruthless business tactics. "Jake," she said, surprised, "how are you?" Honestly, I'm pretty drunk right now, which is probably the only reason I'm making this call." His voice was slightly slurred, but she could hear the guilt and anxiety underneath. "Margaret, listen, I probably shouldn't tell you this, but Richard's been moving money. A lot of money. For months." Margaret's grip tightened on the phone. "What do you mean? Moving money? Offshore accounts? Cayman Islands? Switzerland? Places where it's hard to track." Jake's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "Margaret, I think he's been planning this divorce for a long time. How much money? At least $2 million that I know of. Maybe more." Jake paused, and she could hear the clink of ice in a glass. "And Margaret, Stephanie knows about it. She's been helping him transfer the funds." The room seemed to spin around Margaret. $2 million, hidden in offshore accounts, with Stephanie's help. "Jake," she said carefully, "why are you telling me this? Because it's wrong. Because you've been nothing but kind to me over the years. And Richard is... hell, Richard is my oldest friend. But what he's doing to you is wrong." Another pause, another clink of ice. "And because my conscience has been eating me alive for months. Months! I've known about the affair since it started. I've known about the money transfers. And I've kept my mouth shut because Richard is my business partner and my friend. But when I heard he asked you for a divorce while you're pregnant," Jake's voice broke slightly. "I have daughters, Margaret. If someone did to them what Richard is doing to you, I'd want someone to speak up." Margaret closed her eyes, trying to process this information. Richard hadn't just been unfaithful, he'd been systematically moving money out of their reach, planning his escape while she'd been trying to get pregnant with his child. "Do you have any proof?" she asked. "I have some documentation, bank transfer records, offshore account information. I probably shouldn't have copies, but I do. Would you be willing to share those with my attorney?" A long silence. Then, yeah, I think I would. "But Margaret, if I do this, it's going to destroy my friendship with Richard. It might even damage the business." "I understand, Jake, and I wouldn't ask if I had any other choice." "You shouldn't have to ask. This should never have happened in the first place." He sighed heavily. "Richard used to be a better man. Margaret, I don't know what happened to him. After Jake hung up, Margaret sat in the dark kitchen, staring at her phone. $2 million. Hidden away while she'd been using grocery coupons and questioning whether they could afford a nursery decorator. Hidden while Richard lectured her about being too trusting with money. She thought about their joint bank statements, how Richard had always insisted on reviewing them together each month, explaining the business expenses and investment transfers. She'd trusted him completely, never questioned a single transaction. She'd actually felt grateful for his financial management, believing she was lucky to have a husband who handled such complicated matters. The protection had been a prison, and she'd been the only one who didn't know it. How do you rebuild yourself when the person who knew you best decides you're not worth knowing anymore? The question haunted her as she sat in the darkness, touching her growing belly and thinking about the child who would depend on her strength. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Richard. "Margaret, I hope you're being reasonable about the settlement discussions. There's no need to drag this out or make things more complicated than they need to be." She stared at the message for a long moment, thinking about him sitting somewhere with Stephanie, probably in the hotel room he'd been renting for months, planning how to keep as much money as possible away from the woman who'd supported his dreams for 20 years. She typed back, "I think you should be more worried about your own reasonableness, Richard, especially regarding financial disclosures." His response came quickly. "I don't know what you're implying, but I've always been completely transparent about our assets." Margaret almost laughed. Even caught, he was still lying. She called Jane Crawford's emergency number. "Jane, it's Margaret Sullivan. I think I have the evidence you were looking for." 3 weeks into the forensic accounting investigation, Margaret learned more about her own financial life than she had in 20 years of marriage. She sat in forensic accountant Sarah Mitchell's office, surrounded by spreadsheets and bank statements, watching her life be dissected in columns of numbers. "The pattern is clear," Sarah said, pointing to a timeline she'd created on her computer screen. "Your husband has been systematically moving money out of accessible accounts for over a year." A year, Margaret felt sick. "He's been planning this for a year. Possibly longer? Look at this." Sarah highlighted several entries on the screen. "In January of last year, he transferred $200,000 from your joint savings to a business account. In March, another $100,000 to what he claimed was a new investment fund. In June, he moved your entire inheritance from your parents into an offshore holding company." Margaret stared at the numbers, each one representing another month that Richard had been planning to leave her while she'd been planning their future together. "What about the money Stephanie received?" Margaret asked. "Ah, yes, the consultant fees." Sarah's voice dripped with sarcasm. "Miss Parker has received a total of $300,000 over the past 8 months, allegedly for marketing consultation and business development services." What kind of marketing consultation could she possibly provide? She was a secretary before Richard hired her. According to her employment records, she has a high school diploma and 6 months of community college. Her previous work experience includes retail sales and receptionist duties. Sarah shook her head. "Your millionaire ex-husband paid her more for consultation than most companies pay their actual marketing directors." Jane Crawford looked up from the documents she'd been reviewing. "Margaret, we need to talk about the bigger picture here. The offshore accounts, the hidden assets, the fraudulent consultant payments. This isn't just marital misconduct. This is potentially criminal financial fraud." "What does that mean for me?" "It means we have leverage. It means your husband is in serious legal jeopardy. And it means you're entitled to much more than he's been planning to give you." Margaret thought about Richard's confidence during their last phone conversation, his certainty that she would accept whatever divorce settlement he offered. He'd underestimated her capacity to fight back, just as he'd underestimated her intelligence for 20 years. "There's something else," Sarah said, hesitating slightly. "We found some irregularities in the business accounts that suggest your husband may have been skimming money from his investors." "Skimming money? Taking a larger percentage of profits than he disclosed, inflating expenses, that sort of thing. If we're right, it's securities fraud." Margaret felt overwhelmed. Her husband hadn't just been unfaithful, he'd potentially been running a criminal enterprise while she'd been hosting dinner parties for his clients and investors. "What do we do with this information?" she asked. "First, we use it to ensure you get every penny you're entitled to in the divorce settlement," Jane said. "Second, We decide whether to report the potential criminal activity to the authorities. You mean turn Richard into the police? I mean protect yourself from being seen as complicit in financial crimes you knew nothing about. Jane's expression was serious. Margaret, when this comes out, and it will come out, you need to be clearly positioned as a victim, not as a potential co-conspirator. That evening, Margaret called Claire from her empty house, needing to hear a familiar voice. "How are you holding up, honey?" Claire asked. "I'm learning that my husband is apparently a criminal," Margaret said flatly. 20 years of marriage, and I had no idea who I was really living with. "What do you mean, a criminal?" Margaret explained about the hidden accounts, the fraudulent payments to Stephanie, the potential investor fraud. "Oh my God, Maggie, how much money are we talking about? At least $3 million that he tried to hide from me. Possibly more." Margaret laughed bitterly. "Do you know what the really ridiculous part is? All these years, he made me feel like I was financially irresponsible, like I couldn't be trusted with money. And meanwhile, he was stealing from his own investors. That's called projection. Honey, criminals always assume everyone else is as dishonest as they are." Margaret walked through her house as they talked, looking at the expensive furnishings, the art collection, the luxury finishes. How much of it had been paid for with stolen money? How much of their entire lifestyle had been built on Richard's criminal activity? "Claire, what if I knew?" she asked suddenly. "What if I should have known? What if people think I was involved?" "Maggie, listen to me. You couldn't have known because you're not a criminal. You trusted your husband to handle the finances because that's what normal people do in a marriage. You're not responsible for his choices. But what if— No, stop. You are not responsible for Richard's criminal behavior. You are not responsible for his affair. You are not responsible for any of this." Claire's voice was fierce with protective anger. "You are responsible for one thing, only making sure you and your baby get everything you deserve from this divorce settlement." After they hung up, Margaret sat in her living room, thinking about the conversation she'd overheard between Richard and Stephanie at the cafe. They'd been so casual about hiding assets from her, so confident in their ability to manipulate the system. She thought about all the times Richard had patted her hand condescendingly when she'd asked questions about their finances. All the times he'd explained that she wouldn't understand the complexities of business accounting. All the times he'd made her feel stupid for wanting to be more involved in their financial decisions. The narcissistic abuse had been so subtle, so gradual, that she'd never recognized it for what it was. But now, seeing it clearly for the first time, she felt a rage building inside her that surprised her with its intensity. Richard had stolen more than money from her. He'd stolen her autonomy, her confidence, her sense of her own competence. He'd systematically convinced her that she was incapable of understanding her own financial life, all while he'd been robbing her blind. Her phone buzzed with a text from him. "Margaret, my attorney tells me you're being unreasonable about the settlement negotiations. I hope you'll reconsider your position. There's no need to make this unpleasant for either of us." She stared at the message, thinking about the $3 million he'd hidden, the criminal fraud he'd committed, the years of lies and manipulation. She typed back, "Richard, I think you should be more concerned about making things unpleasant for yourself. Financial fraud is a federal crime." This time, he didn't respond immediately. When her phone finally buzzed an hour later, the message was shorter. "I don't know what you think you found, but I suggest you be very careful about making accusations you can't prove." Margaret smiled grimly. For the first time since this nightmare began, Richard sounded worried, and he should be. The annual Westchester County Children's Charity Gala was an event Margaret had attended for the past 10 years, first as Richard's supportive wife, and later as a member of the planning committee. This year, she almost didn't go. The thought of facing their social circle as a soon-to-be divorced woman felt overwhelming. But Claire had convinced her that hiding would only fuel gossip, and Jane Crawford had agreed that maintaining a strong public presence was important for her image during the divorce proceedings. So Margaret found herself standing in the ballroom of the Westchester Country Club, wearing a black cocktail dress that felt both defiant and appropriate, sipping champagne she couldn't really afford, and trying to ignore the whispered conversations that stopped whenever she approached. "Margaret, darling." The voice belonged to Dorothy Sullivan, Richard's 73-year-old mother, who appeared at Margaret's elbow with the kind of smile that could cut glass. "How lovely that you decided to come tonight." Dorothy had never particularly liked Margaret, though she'd been polite enough during the years when Margaret was useful for hosting Richard's business events. Now, with the divorce proceedings underway, that thin veneer of politeness had vanished entirely. "Dorothy," Margaret replied evenly, "you look well." "Thank you, darling. I must say, I'm impressed by your resilience during this difficult time." Dorothy's voice carried that crisp, upper-class accent she'd cultivated despite having grown up in Queens. Not every woman would handle Richard's decision with such grace. Richard's decision, as if he'd decided to change careers rather than abandon his pregnant wife for his secretary. "It's kind of you to say so," Margaret said diplomatically. "Of course, we all understand that these things happen. Sometimes people simply grow apart, don't they? Sometimes a man needs stimulation that his wife simply can't provide." The implication was clear, and Margaret felt her cheeks burn. But before she could respond, Dorothy had already moved on to another topic. "I do hope you're being reasonable about the divorce settlement. Darling, Richard has worked so hard to build his business. It would be such a shame if vindictiveness were to damage what he's accomplished." "I'm being perfectly reasonable. Dorothy, I'm asking for exactly what I'm entitled to under the law." Dorothy's smile grew sharper. "Of course, dear, though I suppose that depends on how one defines entitlement, doesn't it?" Margaret was saved from having to respond by the arrival of the waitstaff announcing dinner. She found her assigned seat. Someone had mercifully placed her at a table far from Richard's usual crowd and tried to focus on making conversation with the other guests. It was during the salad course that she heard the laughter from the table behind her. She turned slightly and saw Stephanie Parker, resplendent in a red dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, holding court with several of the younger wives. "Like, the whole divorce thing is totally sad," Stephanie was saying, her voice carrying that same Valley Girl inflection Margaret remembered from the cafe. "But honestly, Richard is so much happier now. He says he feels like he can finally be himself. You know, it must be difficult, though," one of the other women said. "I mean, Margaret's been part of our group for so long." "Oh, totally. But like, Richard says she'll be fine. She's getting half of everything, which is actually pretty generous when you think about it." Margaret nearly choked on her wine. Half of everything that Richard had admitted to owning, perhaps, but not half of what actually existed. "Will you and Richard be staying in Westchester?" another woman asked. "Oh yeah, definitely. We're actually looking at that gorgeous estate on Maple Hill Road. You know, the one with the tennis court and the pool house. Richard says it'll be perfect for entertaining. And like, there's plenty of room for when the baby comes." Margaret's hand instinctively moved to her own stomach. Stephanie was talking about starting fresh in a mansion, while Margaret would be lucky to afford a modest apartment. "And the wedding?" someone asked. "When are you thinking?" "Well, we have to wait for the divorce to be final. Obviously. But Richard's attorney says it should be wrapped up pretty quickly. Like, maybe by Christmas, and then we're thinking a spring wedding. Maybe something at the yacht club." Margaret listened to Stephanie plan her future with Margaret's husband, using Margaret's money, in Margaret's social circle. The casual entitlement was breathtaking, needing air. Margaret excused herself and walked toward the ladies' lounge. But as she passed the coat check area, she heard familiar voices from a small alcove near the bar. Richard and Dorothy, having what they clearly thought was a private conversation. "Completely unreasonable," Richard was saying. "My attorney says she's demanding access to business records going back 5 years. "Well, darling, surely that's not a problem if you have nothing to hide." Dorothy's voice was arch. "Of course I have nothing to hide. But frankly, some of the business arrangements are complicated. If Margaret's attorney starts digging around, asking questions—" "What kind of questions?" Margaret stepped closer, keeping herself hidden behind a pillar. "About investor relations, profit distributions, that sort of thing. There are certain efficiencies in our accounting that might be misunderstood by someone without business experience." "Richard, please tell me you haven't done anything foolish." "Nothing illegal, Mother, just creative. The kind of creative accounting that allows me to provide the lifestyle Stephanie expects." Dorothy sighed. "And what about Margaret?" What if she doesn't accept the settlement offer? She'll accept it. Margaret has never been a fighter. She'll take what I give her and be grateful for it. But what if she doesn't? A pause, then Richard's voice, lower and more serious. Then we'll have to encourage her to be more cooperative. What do you mean? I mean we have options. Margaret's family history isn't entirely pristine. Her father's business dealings in the 1980s, for instance. There are some irregularities that could reflect poorly on her character if they were to come to light. Margaret's blood ran cold. Her father had died 10 years ago, and his small construction business had been completely legitimate as far as she knew. You're talking about fabricating evidence, Dorothy said slowly. I'm talking about highlighting existing concerns. Public perception matters in divorce proceedings. Mother, if Margaret appears to have a history of questionable financial judgment, or if questions arise about her family's business ethics, it could significantly impact the settlement. Richard, that's protecting what I've worked 20 years to build. Margaret will get what she deserves. Nothing more. Margaret had heard enough. She walked quickly toward the exit, her heart pounding so hard she could barely breathe. Richard wasn't just hiding assets, he was planning to destroy her reputation with fabricated evidence about her dead father. As she waited for her car from the valet, her phone buzzed with a text from Stephanie. So good to see you tonight. I hope there are no hard feelings. Richard and I really want this to be amicable for everyone. XOXO. Margaret stared at the message, thinking about Stephanie's casual discussion of wedding plans and estate shopping. Then she thought about Richard's conversation with his mother, his willingness to destroy her reputation to protect his stolen money. She typed back, "There will be feelings, Stephanie, just not the ones you're expecting." Then she drove home through the quiet Westchester streets, already planning her next conversation with Jane Crawford. Richard had made a mistake tonight. He'd revealed his hand, shown his willingness to play dirty. And now Margaret knew exactly what she was up against. More importantly, she knew she was fighting for more than money or property. She was fighting for her very reputation, her future, and her child's inheritance. This wasn't just a divorce anymore. This was war. Margaret had been avoiding the Westchester Country Club since the charity gala, but her doctor's appointment ran late on Thursday, and she desperately needed to pick up her prenatal vitamins from the pharmacy nearby. The country club was the most direct route home, and she convinced herself that Richard would be at work. Not playing tennis on a weekday afternoon? She was wrong. As she drove past the tennis courts, she spotted his silver BMW in the parking area. Through the chain-link fence, she could see him on court 3, playing doubles with 3 other men she recognized from various business events. His form was perfect. As always, Richard had been captain of his college tennis team and still played like he was competing for a championship. Margaret pulled into the parking lot, telling herself she would just sit for a moment and compose herself before driving home. Seeing Richard in his element, confident and athletic and completely untroubled by the chaos he'd created in her life, filled her with a rage that surprised her. She was about to leave when a familiar red Porsche pulled up next to her. Stephanie Parker got out, wearing a tennis outfit that probably cost more than Margaret's monthly grocery budget, carrying a designer racket bag and walking toward the courts with the kind of confident stride that suggested she belonged there. Margaret watched Stephanie approach the fence around court 3 and wave at Richard. Even from a distance, she could see his face light up when he spotted her. He held up one finger indicating he had one more game to finish and blew her a kiss. Something inside Margaret snapped. She got out of her car and walked toward the courts, her footsteps crunching on the gravel path. Other club members were scattered around the area, some playing on adjacent courts, others sitting at the outdoor cafe, a few walking the grounds. Margaret recognized most of them from years of social events. "Richard," she called out as she approached court 3. He looked up, startled, nearly missing the ball that was served to him. After returning the shot, a weak backhand that his opponent easily won, he walked toward the fence where Margaret stood. "Margaret," he said, slightly out of breath, "this is unexpected. I need to talk to you. As you can see, I'm in the middle of a game. Perhaps we could schedule—" "I know about the offshore accounts." Richard, his tennis racket froze mid-swing as he prepared to return to the game. Around them, conversations at nearby tables began to quiet as people sensed drama unfolding. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. but his voice had lost its confident edge. $2 million, Cayman Islands, Switzerland. Money you've been hiding for over a year while you plan to leave me? Richard glanced around nervously, clearly aware that they were attracting attention. Margaret, this isn't the place for this conversation. No, I suppose it isn't. Just like the cafe wasn't the place for you and Stephanie to plan how to steal my inheritance. Your inheritance, Stephanie's voice came from behind Margaret. She had approached the fence and was now standing close enough to hear every word. Like, what inheritance? Margaret turned to face her, taking in the perfectly applied makeup, the strategically tousled blonde hair, the tennis outfit that emphasized her youth and fitness. The inheritance from my parents that Richard invested in his business without telling me? The inheritance that's now worth nearly $1 million? The inheritance you two were discussing at the cafe 3 weeks ago? Stephanie's face went pale beneath her bronzer. I don't know what you're talking about. Really, because I heard you discussing it. I heard you planning how to keep me from getting what's legally mine. I heard you talking about taking over my house, my life, my marriage. By now, the conversations at nearby tables had stopped entirely. Margaret could feel eyes on them from all directions, club members pausing mid-sentence to watch the drama unfold. Margaret, you're making a scene, Richard said, his voice tight with embarrassment. Am I? Because I think the scene was made 8 months ago when you started sleeping with your secretary. I think the scene was made when you started moving our money into hidden accounts. I think the scene was made when you decided to destroy 20 years of marriage for a girl young enough to be your daughter. Like, excuse me. Stephanie's voice rose to a register that could probably shatter crystal. I am not a girl. I'm a woman, and Richard and I are in love. Just because you couldn't keep your husband interested doesn't mean you get to take it out on me. The tennis courts had gone completely silent now. Even the players on other courts had stopped to watch. Keep my husband interested, Margaret laughed, the sound carrying across the entire area. Stephanie, he's been married to 4 different women. I'm just the longest one. And judging by his pattern, you've got maybe 3 years before he gets bored with you too. That's not true, Stephanie said, but uncertainty flickered in her eyes. His first wife was 22 when he left her for his secretary. Wife number 2 was 25 when he left her for his business partner's daughter. Wife number 3 was 30 when he left her for me. And I was 32 when he left me for you. Margaret looked directly at Stephanie. The pattern is clear. Honey, you're not special. You're just next. Richard's face had gone red. Margaret, that's enough. No, Richard, it's not nearly enough. Margaret turned back to him. I know about the investor fraud. I know about the fake consultant payments to Stephanie. I know about the fabricated evidence you're planning to use against my father's reputation. Gas rippled through the crowd of onlookers. Several people pulled out their phones. And I know that you think I'm too stupid, too trusting, too weak to fight back. Margaret's voice grew stronger with each word. But you're wrong. About all of it. Stephanie stepped forward, her face flushed with anger. Like, this is totally insane. Richard, aren't you going to do something? What would you like him to do? Stephanie, hit me here. In front of all these witnesses. I would like him to call security and have you removed from the club, Stephanie snapped. You're like totally harassing us. I'm a member of this club, Margaret said calmly. I've been a member longer than you've been an adult. And unless Richard has been hiding that from you too, I'll continue to be a member until our divorce is final. Actually, Richard said, his voice dangerously quiet, your membership was dependent on our marriage. As of our separation, your privileges here have been revoked. Margaret stared at him. It was a petty cruelty, designed to humiliate her in front of their entire social circle. And it worked. She felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. But then she remembered the $3 million he'd hidden, the lies he'd told, the life he'd stolen from her. That's fine, Richard. I suppose I won't be needing a country club membership where I'm going. And where exactly are you going? Stephanie asked smugly. Margaret smiled. Somewhere I can afford a much better class of people. She turned and walked away, leaving Richard and Stephanie standing by the tennis court fence, surrounded by dozens of club members who had witnessed the entire confrontation. As she reached her car, she could hear Stephanie's voice carrying across the parking lot. Like, she is totally losing it. Did you hear the crazy stuff she was saying about Richard's other wives? And what was all that about investor fraud? Margaret got in her car and drove home, her hands shaking on the steering wheel. She'd lost her temper, made a public scene, and probably damaged her reputation in their social circle. But she'd also put Richard and Stephanie on notice. They now knew that she knew everything, and that she wasn't going to disappear quietly. When she got home, she called Jane Crawford. "Jane, it's Margaret. I think I may have just made things more complicated." After the country club disaster, Margaret felt like she was drowning. The humiliation of being publicly expelled from the club, combined with the stress of the ongoing divorce proceedings and her advancing pregnancy, left her exhausted and demoralized. Claire had driven up from the city to spend the weekend, bringing takeout food and the kind of moral support that only a sister could provide. "You need to stop beating yourself up about the tennis court thing," Claire said, unpacking Chinese containers in Margaret's kitchen. Richard and that girl got exactly what they deserved, a public reminder that actions have consequences. "I look like a crazy person. Claire, half the club probably thinks I'm having some kind of breakdown. The other half probably thinks Richard's having a midlife crisis and you're handling it better than they would." Claire handed Margaret a carton of lo mein. "Besides, you're 7 months pregnant and dealing with a cheating husband who's been stealing from you for years. A little righteous anger is completely justified." Margaret picked at her food, her appetite diminished by stress and morning sickness that had never quite gone away. "Jane thinks the public confrontation might actually help our case," she said. "She says it shows I'm not afraid to fight back, which contradicts Richard's narrative that I'm a passive victim who'll accept whatever he offers." "Smart woman. Your lawyer." "She is. But Claire, what if we don't find enough evidence? What if Richard's hidden the money so well that we can't prove it exists? What if the judge believes his version of events?" Claire set down her chopsticks and looked at Margaret seriously. "Then you'll still be better off than you would have been if you just accepted his initial offer. At least now you know what you're fighting for." That evening, after Claire had gone to bed in the guest room, Margaret found herself unable to sleep. Her back ached. The baby was active, and her mind kept racing through all the things that could go wrong with the divorce proceedings. She decided to make herself some herbal tea and maybe look through some of her mother's old photo albums, something that usually brought her comfort when she was feeling lost. The photo albums were stored in the attic, along with boxes of her parents' belongings that she'd never had the heart to sort through after their deaths. Margaret climbed the narrow stairs carefully, mindful of her growing belly, and pulled the cord that turned on the single bare bulb. The attic was exactly as she'd left it years ago, dusty and crowded with the accumulated memories of 3 generations. Her grandmother's china, her father's golf clubs, boxes labeled in her mother's careful handwriting, Christmas decorations. Margaret's school papers. Photo albums, 1985, 1995. She found the photo albums easily enough, but as she was lifting the box, another container caught her eye. It was smaller than the others, made of dark wood, and she didn't remember seeing it before. The brass nameplate on top read, Elizabeth Bennet, her mother's name. Margaret set down the photo albums and carefully lifted the wooden box. It was heavier than she'd expected, and when she opened the lid, she found it contained papers rather than photographs. Legal documents, investment statements, insurance policies, all carefully organized in manila folders. She carried the box downstairs to her father's old study, where the light was better, and began examining the contents more carefully. Most of the papers were routine insurance policies, tax returns, her father's business records, but at the bottom of the box, in a folder marked Family Trust, Confidential, she found something that made her heart stop. It was a letter from a law firm she'd never heard of, dated just 6 months before her mother's death. The letterhead read, Bradley, Morrison and Associates, estate planning attorneys, and it was addressed to Elizabeth Bennet. Margaret read the letter twice before the words fully sank in. Dear Mrs. Bennet, it began, as requested, we have completed the establishment of the Bennet Family Trust. With the provisions you specified, the trust assets, derived from your father Samuel Bennet's estate, will transfer to your daughter Margaret on her 43rd birthday, as originally intended by your father's will. Margaret's hands began to shake. Her maternal grandfather had been Samuel Bennet, a name she'd heard mentioned occasionally, but had never known much about. Her mother had always been vague about her family history, saying only that her father had died when she was young and that he'd been in business. The letter continued. The trust assets currently total approximately $15 million, invested in oil and gas properties throughout Texas and Oklahoma. As you requested, we have maintained absolute confidentiality regarding the existence of this trust, as per your father's original instructions, that the inheritance remains secret until such time as Margaret might need it most. $15 million. Margaret read the number 3 times, certain she was misunderstanding. But there it was, clearly stated in black and white. Her grandfather, a man she'd never met, had left her $15 million. Her mother had known about this her entire life and had never said a word. With trembling fingers, Margaret searched through the rest of the folder and found copies of the original trust documents. According to the papers, Samuel Bennett had been the founder of Bennett Oil Company, a small but successful petroleum exploration business that had discovered several profitable oil fields in the 1940s and 1950s. When he died in 1963, he left the bulk of his estate in trust for his granddaughter Margaret, with specific instructions that she not learn about the inheritance until she reached her 43rd birthday, so that she might first discover her own strength and capabilities before learning of her financial independence. Margaret's 43rd birthday was next month. She found a business card clipped to the trust documents. William Bradley, senior partner, Bradley, Morrison and Associates. She looked at the clock. It was past 11 p.m. Far too late to call a law office, but she knew she wouldn't sleep until she had answers. The next morning, Margaret called the number on William Bradley's business card. A receptionist with a warm Texas accent answered on the second ring. Bradley, Morrison and Associates. How may I help you? This is Margaret Sullivan, Margaret Bennett. I need to speak with William Bradley about a family trust. One moment, please, Miss Bennett. Margaret was surprised when William Bradley himself came on the line almost immediately. Miss Bennett, he said, his voice formal but kind. I've been expecting your call for several years now. Your 43rd birthday is next month, isn't it? Mr. Bradley, I just found the papers last night. I had no idea any of this existed. Your mother specifically requested that the inheritance remain secret until you needed it most. She wanted you to know your own strength first, before learning about your financial independence. Mr. Bradley, Margaret said carefully, I'm in the middle of a divorce, a difficult divorce. My millionaire ex-husband has been hiding assets and trying to cheat me out of what I'm legally entitled to. I see. And would you say this qualifies as a time when you need your inheritance most? Margaret thought about Richard's lies, about Stephanie's smug confidence, about the $3 million hidden in offshore accounts, about the fabricated evidence Richard was planning to use against her. Yes, she said firmly, I would say this definitely qualifies. Then I believe it's time we arranged a meeting. Miss Bennett, there are some things about your grandfather's legacy that you need to understand. 2 days later, Margaret sat in William Bradley's office in downtown Dallas, staring at documents that changed everything she thought she knew about her family. Samuel Bennett had been much more than a small-time oil man. He'd been a visionary who'd built Bennett Oil into one of the most successful independent petroleum companies in Texas. When he sold the company in 1962, a year before his death, he'd been worth nearly $30 million of fortune that had grown to over $50 million in the trust investments over the past 60 years. Your grandfather was a remarkable man, William Bradley told her. He was in his late 60s, with silver hair and the kind of gravitas that came from decades of handling family fortunes. He believed that inherited wealth should strengthen character, not weaken it. That's why he structured the trust the way he did. And my mother knew about all of this. She did. Your grandfather left her a comfortable inheritance, but the bulk of the estate was always intended for you. She respected his wishes about keeping it secret until you were mature enough to handle it responsibly. Margaret thought about her mother's final words before she died. You're stronger than you know, darling. Stronger than any man will ever give you credit for. Now she understood what her mother had meant. She realized that sometimes the hardest part wasn't falling down. It was learning you could get up, dust yourself off, and discover you'd been standing on solid ground all along. Ground that belonged to you. Mr. Bradley, Margaret said, what exactly am I inheriting? William Bradley smiled. Miss Bennett, as of your 43rd birthday next month, you will control assets worth approximately $57 million. You'll be one of the wealthiest women in Texas. Margaret stared at him, the number too large to fully comprehend. But more than that, William Bradley continued, you'll inherit your grandfather's legacy of financial independence and strength. Samuel Bennett never let anyone control him or his money. He built his fortune by making his own decisions and trusting his own judgment. What do I need to do? Come back on your birthday, and we'll complete the transfer of assets. Until then, this conversation remains confidential as your grandfather intended. As Margaret flew back to New York that evening, she thought about Richard's shock when he learned the truth. She thought about Stephanie's plans for a spring wedding and a mansion on Maple Hill Road. She thought about all the times Richard had made her feel stupid about money, all the times he'd protected her from financial decisions. Richard had been so focused on hiding $3 million from her that he'd never considered she might have access to $57 million of her own. Her phone buzzed with a text from him. Margaret, I hope you're ready to be reasonable about the settlement. My patience with these games is running thin. For the first time in months, Margaret smiled as she typed her response. Richard, I think you should be more concerned about your own reasonableness. Some games are about to end, but not the way he expected. The final divorce hearing was scheduled for a gray November morning in White Plains Family Court. Margaret sat in the hallway outside the courtroom, wearing a navy blue maternity suit that Claire had helped her choose, professional but not intimidating, confident but not arrogant. Her legal team had grown since the early days of the case. In addition to Jane Crawford, she now had Sarah Mitchell, the forensic accountant who'd uncovered Richard's hidden assets, and David Martinez, a securities fraud specialist who'd been analyzing Richard's business practices. Remember, Jane said quietly, today is about more than just the divorce settlement. The evidence we're presenting about Richard's financial crimes will likely trigger a federal investigation. This is his last chance to come clean and cooperate. What if he doesn't? Margaret asked. Then he'll discover that hiding money from the IRS is considerably more serious than hiding it from a soon-to-be ex-wife. Across the hallway, Richard sat with his attorney, Marcus Webb, a sharp-featured man in an expensive suit who specialized in protecting wealthy men from expensive divorces. Richard looked confident, almost bored, as if the proceedings were merely a formality before he could get back to his real life. Stephanie sat beside him, wearing a black dress that was inappropriate for court, too tight, too low-cut, too much like something she'd wear to a nightclub. She kept checking her phone and whispering comments to Richard that made him smile indulgently. All rise, the bailiff announced. The Honorable Judge Rebecca Thompson presiding. Judge Thompson was a small woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and the kind of expression that suggested she'd seen every possible variation of human foolishness and wasn't impressed by any of it. This is the matter of Sullivan versus Sullivan, she said, settling behind the bench. I understand we're here for final property distribution and custody arrangements. Mr. Webb, you may begin. Marcus Webb stood and presented Richard's position with the kind of smooth confidence that probably impressed his wealthy clients. He painted Richard as a successful businessman who'd built a fortune through hard work and innovation, and Margaret as a stay-at-home wife who deserved a fair but modest settlement. Your Honor, Mr. Sullivan has already offered Mrs. Sullivan 50% of all marital assets, including the family home, half of his retirement accounts, and generous child support. This represents approximately $2.5 million more than enough to ensure Mrs. Sullivan's comfortable future. Margaret watched Richard nod approvingly, as if he were being generous rather than offering her only the money he couldn't successfully hide. Miss Crawford, Judge Thompson said, your response. Jane Crawford stood, and Margaret could see why she was considered one of the best divorce attorneys in the state. Her presence commanded the courtroom. Your Honor, my client's millionaire ex-husband has systematically hidden assets, committed securities fraud, and engaged in a pattern of narcissistic abuse that spans the entire duration of their marriage. The divorce settlement Mr. Sullivan has offered represents approximately 15% of the couple's actual assets. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Richard's confident expression flickered slightly. Furthermore, Jane continued, Mr. Sullivan has been moving money into offshore accounts for over a year, has made fraudulent payments to his mistress totaling $300,000, and has been skimming money from his business investors in violation of federal securities law. Objection, Marcus Webb said quickly. These are unsubstantiated allegations. I have documentation, Jane said calmly, nodding to Sarah Mitchell, who approached the bench with 3 thick folders. Bank records, transfer receipts, offshore account statements, and investor account discrepancies going back 5 years. Judge Thompson opened the first folder and began reading. The courtroom was completely silent, except for the rustle of papers. After several minutes, she looked up at Richard. Mr. Sullivan, these documents appear to show systematic movement of funds to accounts in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland. Can you explain these transfers? Richard's attorney whispered something in his ear, but Richard shook his head and stood. Your Honor, those transfers represent legitimate business investments. International diversification is a common practice. Mr. Sullivan, Judge Thompson interrupted, these accounts are held in your name alone, not in the name of your business. They were funded with money from joint marital accounts and business accounts that include investor funds. Can you explain why your wife had no knowledge of these transfers? I handle all of our financial affairs. Your Honor, my wife has never had an interest in the complexities of business finance. Margaret felt the familiar sting of Richard's condescension, but it was dulled now by the knowledge of what was coming. I see, Judge Thompson said dryly. And can you explain these payments to Miss Parker? She held up another document. $300,000 over 8 months, allegedly for marketing consultation. Stephanie shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her face flushing red. Miss Parker is a valued consultant, Richard said. Her marketing insights have been invaluable to the business. According to her employment records, Miss Parker has a high school education and no marketing experience. What specific services did she provide to earn $300,000? The question hung in the air. Richard looked at his attorney, who looked back helplessly. Business consultation, Richard said finally. Strategic planning. I see. Judge Thompson made a note. Ms. Crawford, please continue. Jane approached the witness stand. Your Honor, I'd like to call Margaret Sullivan to testify. Margaret stood carefully, her hand on her swollen belly, and walked to the witness stand. She'd been dreading this moment, but now that it was here, she felt calm. Mrs. Sullivan, Jane said, please tell the court about your role in your husband's business. I supported his career for 20 years, Margaret said clearly. I hosted business dinners, attended corporate events, entertained clients and investors. I was told I was too trusting with money to be involved in financial decisions, so I trusted my husband to handle everything. Did you know about the offshore accounts? No. Did you know about the payments to Miss Parker? No. Did you have access to business financial records? No. Richard said I wouldn't understand them. Mrs. Sullivan, Jane said, I'd like you to tell the court about a conversation you overheard at the Westchester County Children's Charity Gala. Margaret recounted the conversation between Richard and his mother. Their plan to use fabricated evidence about her father's business to damage her credibility. And did your father have any business irregularities? Jane asked. No. My father ran a small, legitimate construction company. He paid his taxes, followed all regulations, and never had any legal troubles. Richard's face had gone pale. He whispered urgently to his attorney. Your Honor, Marcus Webb said, standing quickly. My client would like to request a brief recess to review these allegations. No, Judge Thompson said firmly. We'll continue. Ms. Crawford, do you have additional evidence? Jane smiled. Yes, Your Honor. I'd like to present evidence that makes much of this discussion irrelevant. She nodded to Margaret, who reached into her purse and pulled out a folder. Your Honor, Margaret said, her voice growing stronger, I'd like to present evidence of my inheritance from my grandfather, Samuel Bennett. She handed the documents to the bailiff, who passed them to Judge Thompson. According to these trust documents, Margaret continued, I am the granddaughter of Samuel Bennett, founder of Bennett Oil Company. My inheritance, which transfers to me on my 43rd birthday next month, consists of assets worth approximately $57 million. The courtroom erupted. Stephanie gasped audibly. Richard's face went white, then red. What? Stephanie said loudly enough for everyone to hear. Like, how is that even possible? Judge Thompson banged her gavel. Order, Margaret continued calmly. My grandfather structured the trust so that I wouldn't learn about it until I was mature enough to handle the responsibility. My mother kept the secret, as he requested. But recent events have made it clear that I need my financial independence now. Your Honor, Marcus Webb said desperately, this is highly irregular. We've had no opportunity to review these documents. The documents are authentic, Jane said. They've been verified by the trust attorney in Dallas. Mrs. Sullivan will control assets worth $57 million as of next month. Judge Thompson studied the papers for several minutes, then looked at Richard. Mr. Sullivan, it appears your wife's financial situation is considerably different than you represented. Are you prepared to revise your settlement offer? Richard stood slowly, his confidence completely shattered. Your Honor, this is unexpected. I had no knowledge of any family trust. Neither did she, until recently. Which raises the question, if you didn't know about her inheritance, and she didn't know about your hidden accounts, what other financial secrets exist in this marriage? Margaret watched Richard struggle for an answer. The man who'd controlled every aspect of their financial life for 20 years was finally experiencing what it felt like to be powerless. Your Honor, Jane said, given the evidence of Mr. Sullivan's financial fraud and the fact that Mrs. Sullivan will be financially independent regardless of this settlement, we're requesting full disclosure of all assets, criminal investigation of the offshore accounts and investor fraud, and sole custody of the unborn child. Furthermore, Jane continued, we're requesting that Mr. Sullivan pay Mrs. Sullivan's legal fees and provide compensation for 20 years of narcissistic abuse. Judge Thompson looked at Richard, then at Margaret, then back at Richard. Mr. Sullivan, I'm ordering you to provide complete financial disclosure within 30 days. I'm also ordering the immediate freezing of all offshore accounts pending investigation by the appropriate federal authorities. She paused, studying the documents in front of her. As for the divorce settlement, given the evidence of systematic deception and the complexity of the financial arrangements, I'm awarding Mrs. Sullivan the family home, 75% of all verified marital assets, and full custody of the unborn child with supervised visitation for Mr. Sullivan. Richard's face crumpled. Your Honor, that's not fair. I built this business. Mr. Sullivan, Judge Thompson cut him off sharply. You built this business with the support of your wife, using assets that included her inheritance, while systematically deceiving her about your financial arrangements. Fair is exactly what this is. She turned to Margaret. Mrs. Sullivan, given your upcoming inheritance, you clearly don't need alimony. However, I'm ordering Mr. Sullivan to pay your legal fees in their entirety, plus damages for emotional distress in the amount of $500,000. Margaret felt tears running down her cheeks, but they weren't tears of sadness. For the first time in months, she felt hopeful. This court is adjourned, Judge Thompson said, banging her gavel with finality. As Margaret stood to leave, she caught sight of Richard slumped in his chair, his expensive suit rumpled, his face the color of ash. Stephanie was nowhere to be seen. She'd apparently slipped out during the judge's final ruling. Jane Crawford squeezed Margaret's arm. Congratulations, she said quietly. You did it. Margaret looked back one more time at the man who'd controlled her life for 20 years, who'd made her feel small and incapable, and grateful for his protection. He looked smaller now, diminished by the truth of what he'd done. Yes, Margaret said softly. I suppose I did. 6 months later, Margaret sat in the same home office where Richard had asked for a divorce. But everything had changed. The room had been redecorated in soft blues and whites, with new furniture that she'd chosen herself. Sunlight streamed through windows that had been cleaned of the metaphorical storms, and on her desk sat a framed photo of her daughter, Emma Elizabeth Sullivan, born healthy and beautiful just 3 weeks ago. Margaret was reviewing applications for the Margaret Bennett Foundation, a nonprofit organization she'd established to help women escaping financially abusive marriages. The foundation provided legal assistance, temporary housing, and financial planning services to women supporting women who needed to rebuild their lives. Her phone rang, and she smiled when she saw Claire's name on the caller ID. How's my favorite new mom? Claire asked. Tired but happy, Margaret replied, glancing at the baby monitor where Emma slept peacefully in the nursery down the hall. And busy, We've received over 200 applications for assistance this month. That's wonderful. Maggie, Mom and Dad would be so proud of what you're doing. I think they would be, Margaret agreed. Did I tell you that Jake Morrison called yesterday? He's testifying in Richard's criminal trial next month. How did he sound? Relieved, actually. He said he's sleeping better now that he's told the truth. His business is doing well without Richard dragging it down with fraudulent activities. Claire chuckled. And what about the dynamic duo? Any word on Richard and Stephanie? Margaret's smile turned grim. Well, Richard is facing federal charges for securities fraud and tax evasion. His trial starts next month, and his attorney thinks he'll get at least 5 years in federal prison. Good. What about Stephanie? That's the interesting part. Apparently, she left Richard 2 weeks after the divorce was finalized, took the Porsche and moved to California with a personal trainer from the country club. You're kidding. I'm not. Richard sent me a letter from federal custody. He's being held without bail pending trial. He actually had the audacity to say he underestimated me completely, and that, frankly, he thought he knew everything about me, but was wrong about everything that mattered. Margaret had read that letter once, then thrown it in the trash. Some conversations were finished, and she had no interest in rehashing 20 years of mistakes with a man who'd shown his true character so clearly. Speaking of new relationships, Claire said, how are things going with Dr. Williams? Margaret felt her cheeks warm. She'd met David Williams, a pediatrician at Emma's practice, and they'd been having coffee occasionally. He was kind, intelligent, and refreshingly honest about everything, especially money. It's early days, as Margaret said, but he's different. He actually asked to see my financial statements before we went on our second date. That's either very practical or very presumptuous. It's practical. He wanted to make sure I knew he wasn't interested in my money. He makes a good living as a doctor, and he's been through his own difficult divorce. He understands what financial independence means to someone like me. Margaret's other phone line rang the foundation's main number. I should take this, she told Claire. We're expecting a call from a woman in Connecticut who needs help. Go save the world, little sister. I love you. Love you too. Margaret switched lines. Margaret Bennett Foundation? This is Margaret. Ms. Bennett. This is Carol Stevens. I heard about your foundation from my lawyer. My husband has been hiding money from me, and I don't know what to do. Carol, you've come to the right place, Margaret said gently. Let me help you figure out your next steps. As she talked Carol through the process of documenting financial abuse and finding legal representation, Margaret felt the deep satisfaction that came from turning her own painful experience into something that could help others. After the call ended, she walked to the window and looked out at the garden she'd been redesigning. The landscapers had removed all of Richard's formal hedges and replaced them with wildflowers and herbs, a garden that was beautiful but also practical, nurturing but also independent. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. For a moment, her heart skipped, wondering if Richard had found a way to contact her from prison. But when she opened the message, it was from someone completely different. Miss Sullivan, this is David Martinez from the FBI Financial Crimes Unit. I wanted to let you know that your ex-husband's cooperation with our investigation has helped us uncover a larger network of investment fraud. His testimony has been valuable in protecting other investors from similar schemes. Thank you for your courage in coming forward. Margaret smiled and deleted the message. She was glad Richard was finally facing consequences for his actions, but she was more glad that other people would be protected from the kind of narcissistic abuse she'd endured. The doorbell rang, and she heard her housekeeper answer it. A few moments later, there was a soft knock on her office door. Ms. Margaret. Maria called. Dr. Williams is here to see you and the baby. Send him up, please. David appeared in the doorway, holding a small bouquet of flowers and wearing the kind of genuine smile that had attracted her to him in the first place. How are my two favorite girls? He asked, setting the flowers on her desk and moving to look at the baby monitor. We're both doing well, Margaret said. Emma had her longest sleep last night, almost 4 hours straight. That's progress. And how are you feeling about going back to work next week? Margaret was starting as a part-time consultant for a wealth management firm that specialized in helping women manage inherited money. It was exactly the kind of work she'd always wanted to do, using her art history degree and her hard-won financial knowledge to help other women navigate complex financial decisions. I'm excited, she said honestly, and nervous. It's been 20 years since I worked outside the home. You'll be excellent at it, David said confidently. You have something most financial advisors don't have. You understand what it feels like to be powerless over your own money. That empathy will make you invaluable to your clients. As if summoned by their conversation, Emma's cry came through the baby monitor. Margaret started to get up, but David gestured for her to stay seated. I'll get her, he said. You finish what you were working on. Margaret watched him leave and thought about how different this felt from her marriage to Richard. David didn't try to control or manage her choices, he supported them. He didn't make her feel incapable, he celebrated her competence. He didn't hide things from her, he shared everything. From his feelings to his financial statements to his hopes for the future. A few minutes later, he returned with Emma, who had stopped crying and was looking around with the alert curiosity of a very young baby. She's hungry, David said, settling into the chair across from Margaret's desk. And I think she's getting bigger every time I see her. Margaret took her daughter and began feeding her, marveling again at the miracle of this tiny person who depended on her strength and wisdom. David, she said quietly, can I ask you something? Of course. Do you think it's possible for someone to completely change their life at 43? To become someone entirely different from who they were before? David was quiet for a moment, watching Emma nurse with the focused attention she brought to everything. I think, he said finally, that people don't really change who they are, but sometimes life circumstances allow them to become who they were always meant to be. Margaret thought about that as she looked around the office at the foundation materials, at the family photos that now included only people who truly loved her, at the windows that let in so much more light than they had when Richard lived here. She thought about her mother's final words. You're stronger than you know, darling. Stronger than any man will ever give you credit for. She thought about her grandfather's trust fund and his belief that she needed to discover her own strength before learning about her financial security. She thought about Jake Morrison's courage in telling the truth, about Jane Crawford's fierce advocacy, about Claire's unwavering support, but mostly, she thought about the moment in that courtroom when she'd stood up and told the truth about her inheritance, when she'd seen Richard's face change as he realized that all his careful planning and manipulation had been for nothing. She'd learned that strength wasn't about never falling down. It was about learning you could get up, dust yourself off, and discover you'd been standing on solid ground all along, ground that belonged to you. Emma finished nursing and looked up at Margaret with eyes that were already showing hints of intelligence and determination. This little girl would grow up knowing her own worth, understanding her own capabilities, never doubting her right to make her own choices. You know what I realized, Margaret said to David, who was reading one of her foundation newsletters. What's that? I spent 20 years thinking I was lucky to be married to a successful man, but I wasn't lucky I was trapped. The real luck came when he left me for someone else, because that's what forced me to discover who I really was. David looked up from the newsletter and smiled. Margaret Bennett Sullivan, oil heiress and women's advocate. Just Margaret Bennett now, she corrected. I'm going back to my original name. Margaret Bennett, David repeated. I like it. It suits you. Outside, the sun was setting over her garden, painting the wildflowers in shades of gold and pink. Emma had fallen asleep in her arms, and David was reading about the Foundation's latest success story, a woman who'd escaped an abusive marriage and was now working as a financial planner herself. Margaret looked around the office one more time, remembering the storm that had raged outside these windows on the night Richard asked for a divorce. The storm had passed, and she was finally home. Her phone buzzed with one last message of the day, this one from a number she recognized, Jane Crawford. Saw the news about Richard's sentencing, 7 years federal prison. Justice served. Hope you and Emma are thriving. You deserve every happiness. Jane. Margaret smiled and typed back, we are thriving. Thank you for everything. The Bennett women don't give up without a fight, and we won. Then she turned off her phone, settled back in her chair with her sleeping daughter, and watched the last rays of sunlight fade into evening. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to help other women find their strength, new chances to build the life she'd always deserved. But tonight, she was exactly where she belonged in her own home, with her own money, making her own choices, surrounded by people who valued her for exactly who she was. The storm had passed, and Margaret Bennett was finally, truly home.